Hi, this is Darren from Property Prosperity. Today I thought I'd have a bit of a chat about comparing if we're investing in property compared to if we're going to put our money into our super or superannuation fund. So I suppose, I get a few questions about this, particularly from people that sort of get a bit of chunk of money from somewhere and they're not really sure what to do with it. So they might get an inheritance or they might have sold a property and they might have some spare funds available. They might have $100,000 or a couple $100,000 or even $1 million just sitting there and they're like, okay, what do I do with it? Do I invest it in property? Do I invest it in shares? Even if I'm going to... Hey Ashley, thanks for joining. Even if I'm going to invest in property, what type of property do I invest in? Or if I'm going to invest in shares, there's different ways of investing in shares. You can, either invest for dividends or invest for capital gains. There's a whole pile of different options. So what I thought I'd do is sort of outline the pros and cons between putting our money into property and putting our money into shares, and then essentially superannuation funds, but typically superannuation funds are putting your money in shares, essentially. There is opportunities to put yourself money into superannuation funds, and what they do and then invest in property. But to be honest, what they're really doing is you're buying a piece of that property investment. So it might be a piece of a commercial property or a piece of a development, essentially. So it really is a share, and in a similar sense to buying a share in a company, really. So it is really buying a share in a business. It just happens to be it's a commercial property or whatever. So you can still expose yourself to the property market, but understanding it's not the same as you buying directly into a property itself. So the pros and cons. Hey Gulshan, thanks for joining. The pros and cons of getting into property. I'm obviously a big fan of property, so I think it's pretty cool. But the good thing about buying in property is you have something tangible that you can actually see what you're getting. So you can drive past it, you can have a look at it and make sure it's still there. Generally, when you're investing in superannuation or in shares, it's almost like a black box. You put your money into something. They've told you they've invested in a particular company or a particular fund, but really, how do you actually know what they're investing in? They're telling you. The other thing to bear in mind too is someone's investing on your behalf, and obviously you pay them money to do that. Understanding if you're having a fund manager, essentially who's managing your money for you, they get paid a percentage of what you're investing. So let's just say you're investing $100,000, they might get 1 or 2% of that $100,000. So they're not getting a percentage of your profit, they're getting a percentage of what you've invested. So regardless of whether you make money or you don't make money, they're still going to make money anyway. So they, obviously, I'm sure they'd like you to make money, but if you don't make any money, they're still going to make any money regardless. So I suppose you get this conflict to a degree at the end of the day because their percentage that they earn is based on how much you invest. So the more you invest, the better it is, essentially. So you can sort of see why they may have an incentive to try and want you to invest more money into shares than look at other options. Because the thing to understand is that if you go and speak to a financial advisor, financial advisors are legally allowed to give you financial advice. And so the definition of financial advice means that they can actually sell you financial products, and financial products are essentially shares. So if you go to speak to a financial advisor, they can't actually explain to you should go and buy a property or go and buy a residential property and rent it out or a commercial property or whatever, because they're actually legally, they can't give you advice about property because legally definition of financial advice is financial products, which means there's shares essentially. So they really only have one option when you come to get financial advice from them is to sell you shares. And so the thing to understand is when you're speaking to your financial advisor, they're highly likely they're going to suggest to you either put money in super or in super fund, which essentially means shares, or you go and buy shares because that's all they can give you advice about. So that's the first thing to understand is when you're getting someone to give you advice and it's related to shares or to putting money in super, they can only sell you shares. So it's not necessarily an independent viewpoint of what your options are. Second thing is that when they go and actually invest it into a super fund or to shares or some sort of derivative product or these crazy schemes that they may have, you don't actually know, it's really hard to tell what actually happens behind the scenes because if you invest in shares, then obviously you've got to rely on the fact that you're investing into a company. And are those people going to do the right thing with your money? Are they going to make sure they invest it wisely? And you have no control over what happens as far as that's concerned. Whereas if you bought a property, you might buy a unit or a house and you rent it out to a tenant. It's pretty easy. It's pretty clear cut. Okay, we bought it for a certain price. we're renting it out for a certain price. We've got certain costs of managing the property and certain maintenance costs of the property, and we get certain rent coming in. We can really quite clearly see what our return on our investment is. Whereas when we invest in a business and we invest in a portion of that business, it's really, you know how much money you put in there. As far as whether you're getting the best bang for your buck and whether they're using that investment as well as they possibly can, it's really hard to tell. Really, the only people that are going to know that are people that work within that company and actually know what's actually happening in the background. You as an investor, all you get to see is their financial reports. You get to go along to their annual general meeting once a year and ask questions if you like. You can ring them up and ask questions if you like as well. But really, you don't really know what happens behind closed doors. So you don't really know whether they're investing your money wisely. So that's the first thing. With super or shares, it's basically a bit of a black box. You're sort of hoping they're doing the right thing, but you really can never be sure. Whereas with property, you've got some benefits in the fact that you can really see what's happening. You can actually drive past and know you've actually got the property there, and it's less likely for things to go wrong because you can see there's a property there. At the end of the day, people always need somewhere to live, and so when you're investing in property, you're investing in a house for someone. Someone's actually going to live there, and someone always needs somewhere to live. There can be changes in supply and demand, so prices might go up and down, but they're not going to go down to zero because there's always going to be someone that needs to live somewhere. So there's always going to be an intrinsic value in that particular investment or that particular property. Whereas with shares, the value is coming from the profit the company's making and the profit they're going to make over the long term. So even if they're not necessarily profitable now, there's an expectation of profit and there's value associated with that. If the company's not making any profit and there's no expectation for profit to be made in the future, essentially that company's worthless. And so if they don't own any assets, they're not making any profit, and they're not going to make any profit in the future, then there's zero value in that particular investment. And so you might have invested, $1,000 or $100,000. If there's no chance of them returning any money, then it's not going to be worth any value whatsoever. And so in reality, your investment can be worth nothing. Whereas with property, it can never be worth nothing because someone will always rent it out, whether it's worth less or more. It's always some degree of value associated with it. So it gives you that buffer, knowing that you're always going to have some sort of value there. And there's, historically, property has, over time gone up. So, they talk about property doubling every 10 years. The thing to understand with property doubling every 10 years, it doesn't necessarily go up evenly over 10 years. So it might actually do nothing for 10 years. And then suddenly there's a big kick where the market goes up, or it might go up quickly for a few years and then sort of cool back, or it might go gradually up over time. So properties, and likewise with shares, they can go up over time gradually. The key to when you're investing in property, just like whether you're investing in shares, is the key to getting there for the long term. A lot of people are inclined when they get into property into shares, is to buy and sell, hoping for quick capital gains, which can be a good thing as an opportunity to make some short-term gains. Sometimes that is a bad thing because quite often you make the most benefits of hanging in for the long term and trying to get that long-term benefit as a company's building itself up. And you can, you imagine if you invested in Facebook or, Google or any of these big companies that have built up over time. At the start, they weren't making much money, but if you hang in for the long term, you get the benefit of it. They started trying to put money in their pocket, then you get to get some of the benefits of that. So generally, they talk about trying to invest for the long term. It usually works best for shares. Likewise, it does work best for property as well, investing for the long term. The good thing and the bad thing about property is actually quite expensive to get into property. So you have to pay stamp duty when you buy property, and when you sell it, you have real estate agent fees. So compared to buying in shares or buying into a super fund, you can buy and sell shares, and it's relatively inexpensive. It's just the cost of the brokerage, and so you can actually buy and sell quite quickly. So the reason why that's a good thing and a bad thing for property is because it's a bad thing that it costs you money to buy and sell, but it's also a good thing because you're less likely to buy and sell, which means you're more likely to hang on to property for the long term, and you're more likely to get the benefits of the long-term capital gains. Whereas with shares, because it's quite easy to buy and sell in shares, you're more likely to buy and sell, which means you're probably more likely to miss out on those long-term capital gains you're going to get by hanging on to the shares for the long term. So quite often you find people buy and sell too quickly, and that's actually to their detriment. So and then some of the other benefits of property compared to shares, there is taxation benefits as far as property is concerned. So you get something called negative gearing, which basically means if you're making a loss, you can claim that back as a tax deduction. But you also get depreciation benefits, so you can claim the property as it's wearing out. So you might find that's beneficial for you to minimise your tax. And so, tax wise, it might be better for you. You can still claim negative gearing benefits as far as shares goes, if there's some holding costs associated with the shares. But generally, you might not be able to claim as many benefits as you would if you're investing in property. Probably the last final thing to think about as far as investing in property goes is the benefit of what's called leveraging. So the ability to be able to borrow money to be able to buy a property. Because the banks find it a more secure investment to invest in property, they're willing to lend you more money. So you'll find they'll lend you 80%, and they'll even lend you up to 90, 95% if they charge you what's called mortgage insurance to try and cover some of their risk. So that allows you to, if the example you're going to borrow, buy a $500,000 property and you are going to kick in 20%, then you can put in $100,000 and you can have a property worth $500,000. Or likewise, if you're going to borrow 95%, you'll be able to borrow, put in relatively small amounts of money, and you'll be able to buy a property for $500,000. With investing in shares, because the banks consider it a lot more risky because they think it's a lot more volatile, they're willing to lend you a lot less money, and they'll be quite particular in what they'll actually lend you. So, what you will allow you to invest in. So they won't necessarily allow you to invest in all shares. It'll probably be more like blue chip shares that are less likely to be as volatile. And so the issue with that is that, you don't get to leverage and get to, essentially you can kick in $100,000 in an investment property, and which was worth $500,000. If prices go up by 10%, then you've suddenly made 50% returns on your gains because it's gone from $500,000 up to $550,000, which is a $50,000 gain. But if you've only invested $100,000, then you've almost 50% gain on the investment you've made. Whereas if you only invest if you invest in a large amount of money, then you're going to make a lot less percentage gain relative to how much money you've invested. So hopefully that's made sense. I know it was a bit confusing, but basically leveraging is a good thing. Also, what you're doing is you are leveraging, which means you're opening yourself up to more risk as well. But that's why property is a lot less risky, so more likely to have the less downsides and more likely to have more upsides as far as property goes. So hopefully that's made sense to you. You can sort of see some of the pros and cons. Obviously, there is good things and bad things about. There is some taxation benefits with investing in super. The government actually gives you some benefits as far as claiming tax deductions, as well as they give you other little taxation benefits investing in super as well. So really my advice to you is go to your accountant, have a bit of a chat to them about your situation. Go and have a chat to a financial advisor, but bearing in mind, understanding that their job is to sell shares, and so they are going to be geared towards shares, and they're less likely to suggest you invest in property. So just make sure you get a good understanding of all your options, and make sure you're clear of the pros and cons of both property and as well as investing in super. And then just make sure you invest with your eyes open, so you're clear with what your long-term goals are and what's going to help you to get you where you want to get to, hopefully. So if you like what I had to say, then click on the like button. If you haven't liked what I had to say, then still click on the like button, because I really appreciate it. And if you know someone that's just got a big chunk of cash in their bank account and they're not really sure what to do, whether they should go into shares or super or whack it into property, then click on the share button. Hopefully they'll find this interesting, and hopefully it'll point out some of the pros and cons, and hopefully it'll make their decision a lot clearer on what they should do and what their options are. So thanks, guys. If you've got something you'd like to talk about, or you're struggling with this decision, then I'm happy if we put a comment in the comment box, and I'm happy to have a chat to you about it. Or if you want to have a chat, then feel free to message me, and I'm happy to have a chat and maybe point out some of the pros and cons, and maybe I can point you in the right direction. So thanks, guys. Look forward to talking to you again next time. Bye.